Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Marek Milde, and I would like to welcome you on the behalf of the Czech Center New York here on our virtual stage. Behind me, you can see the Bohemian National Hall, where the ticket to the new world was supposed to be now on view as an exhibition. However, we had to move the project to the fall of the next year, but hope you can all join us here. In the meantime, we are very happy we can present this interesting topic in this way. Ticket to the New World follows the stories of 16 significant cultural figures of the First Czechoslovak Republic, artists who at the beginning of the World War II decided to leave the country, either out of fear of persecution or because they refused to live under a totalitarian regime. Often, it was a great act of courage. The project has been originally presented in Prague in 2018, organized by the Czech National Trust as a part of the centennial celebration of the Czech Republic to celebrate the historic Czech-American connection and the special relationship between our countries. The project curator, Eva Haid, will join us very soon to the discussion together with our guests, Julia Hammid, Véronique Firkušný, and Ladislav Zikmund, who are scholars or direct relatives of some of these famous Czechs. And after the presentation, you will also be able to ask questions via the chat. First, I would like to introduce Eva Haid. Eva Haid, the project instigator, is an artist, journalist, author, and curator. She currently manages several projects of the Czech National Trust. Born in Prague, she later immigrated to the US. Here she lived for 20 years, working as a photographer for prestigious museums and galleries in New York. Recently, she concentrates on projects connecting Czech and American culture. In her life, she connects our two countries through the art and can speak from experience. I can't imagine anybody better suited to present this project. Eva, please welcome.
Hello, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And I would like, first, I would like to introduce the organizer of the project, which is the Czech National Trust, or shortly CNT. CNT is a non-profit charitable organization that was established in the Czech Republic in 2013. It is supported by eminent heritage experts in the Czech Republic and also by International National Trust Organization, or shortly INTO. Inspired by the British National Trust model, the founders envisioned a national volunteer movement for preservation of historic buildings, gardens, and cultural landscape. As such, the trust takes care of tangible but also intangible heritage. One of the examples of this type of activity is the project Ticket to the New World. Let's see the introductory film for the project now.
The Ticket to the New World is a project that commemorates extraordinary individuals of the art scene who were forced to leave Czechoslovakia in the beginning of World War II to the United States and influence the cultural scene there. Those who returned home after the war brought with them new and invaluable experiences. Voskovec and Véronique were a famous acting duo associated with the liberated theater during the First Republic. They were inspired by the comics of their time, such as Charlie Chaplin. They criticized Hitler and the Nazi regime and had to immigrate to the United States before the outbreak of World War II. After the war, they came back home, but then parted ways. Véronique decided to stay, and Voskovec returned to the States to build a career on Broadway and in Hollywood. His most significant role was in the movie 12 Angry Men. Jan Véronique played in and directed films in Czechoslovakia, and the two were not in contact for some time. Later, their brotherly bond was renewed through letters they sent each other. Paul Fierlinger is to this day at the top of the list of American animators. The son of Czech diplomats, he was born in Japan, brought to the US, and placed into foster care in Burlington. He was returned to Czechoslovakia for political reasons, where he spent his teenage and young adult years in the communist regime. When he finally managed to return to America, he made a living by making short instructional clips and political commercials. He was the main author to a number of his projects as a scriptwriter, director, artist, and animator. Later, he founded his own art studio, ARNT Associates, where he worked with his wife, Sandra. He worked on more than 700 projects from short animated movies to full feature-length films. He became renowned for films such as Rainbow Land and the Oscar-winning It's So Nice to Have a Wolf Around the House. A man that had a significant role in the American art scene was, oddly enough, not an artist, but a theorist and curator, Thomas Messer. He moved to the United States in 1939 as a student on scholarship. Over time, he managed various art institutions until one day he was asked by Harry Guggenheim to become the director of the Guggenheim Museum in New York. He worked there for 27 years. During that time, he noticeably expanded its collection. He also succeeded in connecting the Venice collection of Peggy Guggenheim to the New York institution. He curated a number of exhibitions by famous American artists and presented artists from Europe as well as other parts of the world. The New York Times wrote that Thomas Messer was one of the most significant figures of American modern art. The trip into immigration alone during the tense atmosphere of the 1930s and 40s was frequently complicated and dangerous. In addition, for artists who were renowned at home, it meant to start all over again. Nonetheless, many succeeded and were able to contribute in an important way. The Ticket to the New World offers a glimpse into the often complicated lives of these people and brings a new perspective on Czech-American relations.
The film you have just seen mentioned only some of 16 artists presented by the project. Majority of the expats settled directly in New York, and one of the most visible groups here were musicians, thanks to their immediate success. When Bohuslav Martinů came to the US, he was already famous composer and had succeeded at home, but also internationally, mainly in Paris. Jarmila Novotná belonged to top singers of the European opera already before her entry to the Metropolitan Opera. And 27-year-old Rudolf Firkušný was an acclaimed pianist who at the age 10 played with the Czech Philharmonic. We are very lucky to have here with us today his daughter, translator and editor, Véronique Firkušný, who will talk about her father and the atmosphere of the time period some 80 years ago. Véronique, please welcome to us. Welcome.
Hello.
To come.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I just wanted to say thank you, first of all, for inviting me to participate, because I think that personal memories and oral histories are so important in keeping alive the memory of people who made such a contribution to spreading the word about Czech culture. And I was thinking really about what I wanted to say. I think I'd like to start with the fact that, first of all, my father and Bohuslav Martinů had a very, very long friendship, and it started back in Paris in 1934, and it continued and became much stronger here in the United States and specifically in New York, and continued until Martinu's death in 1959. So I never actually met Bohuslav Martinu, but I can't remember a time that I was not aware of him for two reasons. In a very, very sort of simple, easy way, we lived when we were growing up on 55th Street off 6th Avenue. And as children, we would be going in and out of Central Park. Here we have the picture of Central Park every day. And every time we walked from our corner on 55th and 6th up 6th Avenue and past the corner of 58th Street, if my father was with us, which he sometimes was, he would always say, "Ah, tady bydlel Bohušek. This is where Martinu used to live." And when they first arrived in this country, fleeing from occupied France after Czechoslovakia had already been occupied, they arrived at a time that was very, very close. My father arrived December 1940, Bohuslav Martinu in 1940, sorry, am I right? Yes, 41. Gosh, that's a long time ago. So I think that they were living on the same street. In fact, my father used to tell me that on 57th Street, there's a huge building between 6th and 5th Avenue. It has sloping sides and there is an orange number 9 in front of this building. That building went up on a block, a part of the block where there were a lot of low houses. And I think that that is where Martinu was living at the very beginning when he first came. So not only physically was there this sense that we were living in the neighborhood where Martinu and my father had spent a lot of very important years and times, but also I can't remember a time when my father wasn't playing Martinu's music. So long before I really knew it was Martinu, his music was familiar to me and to my brother. Their friendship, I think, was kind of a remarkable one. They were 22 years apart in age. My father was 22 years younger, and he met Martinu originally in person in Paris in 1943. By then, he was already familiar with his works because, as Eva mentioned, Martinu was already a very successful and acclaimed composer, both nationally and internationally. My father always used to say that at the time when he was growing up in Brno, they had 2 wonderful opera houses, and because it was a subscription series, the only way to keep people coming back again and again was to have an extremely varied program. So they would program all sorts of music and all sorts of operas and ballets, so that my father saw most of the Martinu premieres still in Brno and fell in love with the music before he met Martinu in person. They met in 1943 in Paris, and from everything I know from my father, they became very, very close, almost like brothers already back then. That relationship was further strengthened because they were in Paris at this unbelievable time, which was both very exciting culturally and in terms of the musical scene, the artistic scene. There was a group of Czech expats there that my father used to talk about that included Bohuslav Martinu, Vitka Kapralova, the artist Rudolf Kundera, trying to think who else. Those are the ones, Jiří Mucha. Those are the names that I remember from having heard him talk about and reference from time to time. They also were there when it suddenly became necessary to flee from Paris. And what happened was the situation was very, very tense. Czechoslovakia Munich had happened, Czechoslovakia had become occupied. My father was waiting in Paris to basically see what was going to happen next. They were all together, this group in Paris, when France officially entered the war, and it was a cause for great celebration and hope. My father said at that point, it was very exciting actually, because they launched into playing propaganda concerts and lots of activities to support this entrance into the war. And then as things became very bleak, it became clear that being in Paris was actually precarious. And my father had a connection in the Avenue de la Bourdonnais office, which was one of two Paris offices closely connected to the Czech expat government, that one particularly close ties with the London branch. And he, at that point, had a visa to come to America. He was supposed to come. The Czech government was prepared to sponsor his trip to come. But with the situation being what it was, he really didn't know whether he should wait until his scheduled flight, which was not for another several days or possibly even a week, or if he should really get out. So he had a contact at the time, a man named Ivo Duchacek, whose widow I actually remember meeting here in New York as a child. That was Mrs. Spoldova. But this person, Ivo Duchacek, said, you know, call me tomorrow, and if I tell you the meeting is on, you're fine to stay. If I tell you our meeting is off, it means that our government has, our embassy and consulates are clearing out and you need to get out as soon as possible. So when my father called the next day, this Ivo Duchacek said, our meeting is off. And the first call that he made at that point was to Bohuslav Martinu. And Martinu had not been aware of how precarious the situation was. And for this reason, it's often said that my father saved Bohuslav Martinu. The fact was that had he not made that call, Martinu probably wouldn't have realized he needed to get out. And they both set about leaving Paris that very same day. The journey, their respective journeys are so fascinating and would take so much more than 5 or 7 minutes. But they did, I just want to say very quickly, they did actually reconnoiter in Marseille, Martinu in Aix and my father in Marseille, waiting to get an exit visa to leave France, to be able to get via Spain to Portugal and from there here. And it took 3 months of waiting to get this, this exit visa. And why I mention it is that at that time, Martinu being in Aix and my father in Marseille, my father would take the train very frequently to go visit Martinu, who at the time was working on his Fantasy and Toccata. And I think that probably as a child was one of the pieces that I first really fell in love with Martinu, because you hear this train sound all the time. And my father finally said, well, yes, that's because, you know, I was always on the train going back and forth. So I reference it because it's one of the most poignant to me, in a way, works that represent how the whole situation they found themselves in and their friendship resulted in the creation or birth of that particular composition. And of course, there were others as well. How am I doing on time?
Thank you so much. I can wait. I hope we will have during next year, when the ticket will be presented in New York, you can come and talk a little bit more, because it's really exciting and very interesting, and a lot of things which I didn't have any idea. So I hope it's gonna be great when you share these memories with all of us.
I look forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Véronique. I would like to invite also Julia Hammid. I would like to say that while the musicians were connected by friendship in the city, the filmmakers and photographers were more dispersed. 2 photographers stayed in New York. It was Alexander Hackenschmidt and Bedřich Greenzweig. Alexander Hackenschmidt changed his name to Axel or Sasha Hammid, and under that name he became famous as an avant-garde photographer and filmmaker. And he established himself as a director, cameraman, and editor of documentaries. Together with Francis Thompson, they pioneered the technically demanding IMAX format, and in 1965 they received the Academy Award for the best documentary for the film To Be Alive. Some of us elder visitors of Czech Center events may remember his photo exhibition connected with his 90th birthday celebration in 1998. We are honored to have here his daughter, Julia Hammid, who who will share some memories of her father. Well, Julia, can you please join us?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm quite honored. And I wish I could say as much about my father that Véronique did. He was famous for being quiet and for having so much that people didn't know about him. I do have some short little memories that I collected, and mostly I know that we're focusing on his coming to the US and that time and the early years, which I really know very little of. But an interesting kind of a funny contrast, which is that he came because he was working with a producer named Herbert Klein, who was working on documenting the rise of Nazism in Europe. And he engaged my father as his cameraman and sort of cohort at that time. And they worked together and filmed many things, and then went to Paris to do the editing or to take the footage out of the country. And I didn't really know any of the details of how that journey progressed. But I went to an event once where Mr. Klein was talking about their life and their career together. They worked together in the US for a few years after my father came, and then they went in different directions. But that was the first time that I had heard really any conversation about how the journey actually progressed. And Herbert Klein was in some ways the opposite of my father. So my father was extremely quiet, sort of internal, very self-effacing kind of a person. And Herbert Klein was the opposite. He was very gregarious, and he liked to tell big stories and make everything very dramatic. And the story that he told was that they had had an extremely exciting and dangerous journey on a boat across the Atlantic, being pursued by submarines and all kinds of German attacks and things like this, and arrived in Nova Scotia safely. And as far as my father was concerned, it was a non-eventful journey. Yes, they came by ship and everything was fine and they made it, and that's all there is to the story. So that's the kind of example of the way that my father would talk about his life. But I knew him really more, as my father, and I am still learning more about his career. When he came to the US, he lived first in Los Angeles and actually was trying to make some connections with Hollywood. Not too much came of that. They did make one film, Forgotten Village, which was a sort of a Hollywood-ish film or a main screen film. But other than that, my father found himself more in the art world and than documentary films, and had just a very long and extremely respected career as a documentary filmmaker. This is a photograph that he took on a trip that he made in 1936 to the US in advance of his actual emigration. He was working in Prague, or not in Prague, in the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia at the time, in Zlín at the Bacha Film Studios, making films, which is where he learned much of his craft. And Mr. Bacha was the great world traveler and had businesses all over the world and wanted to document his travels. And also build up his film studio, and several of his employees at the film studio were sent to the US, to Hollywood in 1936 to gather equipment and learn things and make connections. And so that was a very exciting trip that my father took, which actually led to, this is a picture of my father with Frances Thompson, probably early in their work together, because they look quite much younger than I remember them. I think this trip in 1936 really ignited a kind of yearn for travel that my father had really all his life. He traveled a tremendous amount, mostly for film work, but I think he enjoyed it absolutely every time, all over the world. So what I was leading to say is that my understanding is not so much that he was trying to escape the European situation, because he did have to escape, but that he said he always wanted to come to the US. He really wanted to explore the world and to live in this new exciting place. And the little that I know about his first experiences, he was just overwhelmed and entranced with everything in the US and how things work. So that was a goal of his always. I want to mention that this background that I have behind me is a virtual background. It's the building that he lived in from 1948 until his death in 2004, and where I grew up in 89th Street and Central Park West in Manhattan. It's wintertime in this picture, and the orange that you see are the installation by Christo of the Gates. Some of you from New York may remember that. My father really enjoyed that a lot. He was a big fan of sort of environmental kinds of situations and art. He went to a lot of galleries. He loved going to the films, and he walked everywhere. And I'm sort of running out of time here, but there's more I could say. He loved living where he lived. The apartment was tremendous home for him, and the park was kind of his backyard. Up until practically days before he died, he walked every day in the park, less and less, but as much as possible, and he walked to work and back. His office with Francis Thompson was on the east side, 51st Street, so he walked from 89th Street in Central Park to 51st Street and 2nd Avenue, back and forth every day, and he loved that. He loved the park and just watching everything, small changes going all the time. He had a Czech community around him. I grew up with knowing a lot of Czechs in the neighborhood, some of whom were, I know Mr. Kolda, who lived a few blocks away, who was a colleague of his from the Bata studio, who I think came later, and also Jan Lucas, another photographer that we knew well. So I grew up hearing a lot of Czech, and he was deeply immersed in that culture, even though he was very excited to be living in the U.S. and being part of the world community. So I don't have any sort of trajectory to say, but there's a lot more that I could say about him as a person, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's very interesting, and I believe you also send me some letters, which would be great to put them into exhibition as a part of the memories. So I'm looking very much to it. Thank you, Julia. Okay. Now, project Ticket to the New World also cast a light on the fates and achievements of several important Czech architects and designers. Architect Jaroslav J. Polívka and designer Ladislav Sutnar came to the USA in relation with Czechoslovak Pavilion at the New York World's Fair in 1939. Neither of them returned to their country, and both of them stayed in America. During the following years, Polívka took part in organic architecture projects with famous American architect Frank Lloyd Wright. Czech architecture historian Ladislav Zikmund, who has been researching Polívka's work for several years now, is here with us to talk about him. Ladislav, please join us. Hello?
Oh, there we go. Can you hear me?
Great, thank you.
Hello, everyone. I prepared about 8 to 9 minutes talk about Jaroslav J. Polívka's life. So let me get straight to it. When I first came to the United States in 2016, I attended a lecture and a book presentation on Frank Lloyd Wright in San Francisco by Stanford professor of architectural history, Paul V. Turner. When he described the fascinating story of the Butterfly Bay Bridge, he kept mentioning the name Polívka, which sounded Czech to me. I had absolutely no idea who he was. So I started a little Googling, and a fascinating story of a great architecture, many friendships and cooperations, many famous names, and a very adventurous emigration revealed to me. Soon, I got in touch with Jaroslav J. Polívka's amazing grandchildren, who were very helpful in getting to know the life and work of their grandfather, and let me study a lot from their family archives, and some of them are here with us today, so hello everyone. Jaroslav J. Polívka came to the United States in 1939 to supervise the building of a Czechoslovak pavilion at the World Fair in New York, which was designed by Czechoslovak architect Kamil Roškot, and some of the interiors were co-designed by Ladislav. 3 weeks before the World Fair was supposed to open, Czechoslovakia became the protectorate of the German Third Empire, and the German officials tried to prevent the opening of a separate Czechoslovak pavilion since Czechoslovakia ceased to exist as an independent country. However, the Czechoslovak architects, designers, and organizers decided to open the pavilion intentionally unfinished as a form of protest. Jaroslav's son Miloš, who was a structural engineer too, came to the United States as well. Jaroslav Polívka made it home when he rushed back to San Francisco Bay Area with his other son, because there was supposed to be a World Fair in San Francisco Bay Area in 1940. Some part of it happened on the Treasure Island, so maybe he acquired some good contacts in the Bay Area from the New York World Fair. His wife, who had her parents in Prague, stayed behind, but in the last minute she managed to leave Czechoslovakia. She made her way to San Francisco through Russia and Japan, which was an incredible journey which took several weeks for a woman traveling alone. Jaroslav Polívka first opened his own structural engineering office with a seat in Hogarth Building on Market Street in San Francisco. Soon he moved to Berkeley, where he bought and remodeled his own house. He did many structural experiments with pre-stressed concrete on his own house, like we can see here. For example, a roof over his parking space. He started an unpaid job at the Department of Structural Mechanics at UC Berkeley, which soon turned to a regular paid job. During the World War II, he also started to work for Kaiser Industries in Richmond, which became famous for their quick construction of battleships. They assembled pre-manufactured parts. Richmond thus became a very dynamic part of the bay, so a lot of structures were built, housing, shelters, warehouses, hospitals, and so on. I'm still not quite sure what segment of the construction Jaroslav Polívka became the part of, but there were many experiments with structural engineering going on, mostly using pre-manufactured concrete components. There were also experiments with portable hospitals units made from aluminium. Besides helping fighting the common enemy, these Richmond experiments must have been very fascinating for Jaroslav Polívka. In April 1946, Jaroslav Polívka wrote a letter to a world-famous architect, Frank Lloyd Wright. Shortly before that, Wright wrote in the Architectural Record Journal that structural engineers usually do not have any imagination and are rigid. Jaroslav Polívka wanted to convince him otherwise, and he mentioned his fascination with spider webs. That caught Wright's attention because it corresponded with his idea of learning from nature and this concept of organic architecture. Wright was usually very brief in his letters, so he simply wrote, "Why don't you come see us at Taliesin West?" In May, a few weeks later, Polívka made the trip to Arizona, Wright's winter and spring residence, and he immediately started to work on the structural calculations for the Guggenheim Museum. Wright and his apprentices were not quite able to figure out how to build the spiral ramp, which opens up towards the sky without any internal support. Polívka, with his son Miloš, designed a solution and created a glass model, which proved that they were right. After this experience, Wright asked Polívka to cooperate on 5 more projects, which were usually very challenging in the matter of construction. Polívka figured out how to put the mushroom columns on top of each other, which Wright used in the Johnson's Tower in Racine, Wisconsin. Wright wanted Polívka to introduce him to Eduardo Torroja, a very famous Spanish architect and structural engineer, and all 3 started to work together. The Mile High Building project, or a tribune for a sports stadium in New York, where Torroja contributed with his idea of hanging concrete roofs. Concerning the other 2 projects Polívka did with Wright, he was not asked by Wright. It was actually the other way around, or something like that. At the turn of 1940s and 1950s, the idea of 2 new bridges across the San Francisco Bay came to life. Polívka first drew his own design of a bridge with large repeating arches and with a hanging cableway. The other bridge was supposed to be low and had a central metal part that turns around when the ship wants to come through. The slogan was 2 bridges for a price of 1. However, Polívka soon asked Wright to cooperate on the architectural design for the southern bridge, leading from Alameda Island to central waterfront in San Francisco. Wright came up with an extraordinary design of a very elegant bridge spans, and the central part was supposed to hang higher because of the large ships going through. And the decks split in the central part, and there was a hanging part between them with grass, trees, bushes, benches, and paths, as we can see in the picture. Wright and Polívka tried very hard to enforce this idea. However, with the plan to build BART under the bay, all plans for the new bridge disappeared. Frank Lloyd Wright and his San Francisco office had a very powerful and a rich client there, V.C. Morris. His shop is one of the most famous Wright projects for the San Francisco Bay Area. V.C. Morris asked Wright to design him a house on a rock in the Sea Cliff area in San Francisco. Wright and Aaron Green, the head of his San Francisco office, couldn't figure out how to calculate the construction of the first design, where the house was literally hanging from the cliff, so they designed a more moderate version. Somehow, Jaroslav Polívka found out about their structural issues with the first design, so he did the calculations, figured out how to build Wright's first design, and gave these calculations to V.C. Morris. No need to say that Wright was furious when he found out about it, and he wrote a very angry and unusually long letter to Polívka saying, "You are my engineer, I am not your architect." This split between Wright and Polívka was supported by Aaron Green, who wrote that one of Jaroslav Polívka's buildings in Europe had collapsed. That was true. He was referring to the Stock Exchange building in Rotterdam, but it collapsed because it was bombed during the World War II. Jaroslav Polívka was also a very successful engineer and structural designer in the Bay Area on his own. In 1949, he co-designed with William Patrick and 3 other Frank Lloyd Wright's apprentices a house for Mr. Patrick and his new family in Redwood City. Polívka even designed his own version of textile blocks that this building is made of. We saw them in the last picture. In 1952, he co-designed a Chinese Methodist church in Oakland made of pre-manufactured Gothic arches. The architecture of the church was supposed to be East meets West. That's why the Gothic arches combined with the traditional design of a Chinese monastery. He also designed houses on Arch Street in Berkeley. One of them was supposed to be a prototype for serially developed projects. Other buildings were inspired by Richard Neutra's LA apartment buildings. In 1950s, Jaroslav Polívka also became a professor at Stanford, so he was teaching at the 2 most prominent universities in the Bay Area. Jaroslav Polívka was 53 when he came to the United States. At that age, he started a new life. He started a new career. He became one of the top engineers in the world, despite the fact that his cooperation with Wright and Toroha was a bit forgotten for a couple of decades. And he started a new, fascinating research on photoelastic analysis of pre-stressed concrete. He kept thinking of how to improve his field and how to make people's lives easier, while at the same time, he created beautiful buildings. His life story remains an inspiration for how to stay curious, be in the middle of things, inspire other people, make his American dream, and as various memories tell us, be always kind and joyful. Jaroslav Polívka died in February 1960, only 10 months after passing of Frank Lloyd Wright, whom he never stopped admiring. Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ladislav. Thank you, Véronique, again, Julia. It was a pleasure to hear some details about the protagonists of the Ticket to the New World. And I hope that participants of the webinar enjoyed a little tasting of what will take place in the Czech Center and in BBLA next year. The Czech Center exhibition will present Hammid photographs and his films Also caricatures by Adolf Hofmeister and Antonín Pelc, samples of Sutnar industrial design, and artwork by Alain Divish. The show will be accompanied by several events such as talks and additional shows organized in collaboration with BBLA, SVU, and DAHA. There is a book published by Czech National Trust in 2 languages, both languages, Czech and English, and it will be also available. Authors of individual chapters were Czech experts, but also American researchers whose work is related to the topic. For example, Majda Kalab was writing about Rudolf Firkušný. Well, I look very much to meet you in person at some of these events. And now...
Thank you very much, Eva. That was very interesting. We will take some questions from the audience now. We got already some in the chat. I also would like to encourage the audience to write your questions on our guests and on Eva. And before we start, I would be very curious to ask myself, because Eva, you have been immigrant artist in New York yourself. How was this experience for you, and how it inspired this project?
Well, I think that the transition from one world to the other is always rather complicated, and the adaptation really takes years. It is an unusual experience, like I would say living 2 different lives. I still have this feeling like living 2 different lives. And I believe in some ways this is common to many immigrants. So in the case of our protagonist, I simply try to put myself to their shoes and understand what they had to go through.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Thank you. And now we can look into the chat.
Okay. There is a question to Mr. Lender. Could you provide the name of the building in San Francisco that you showed? It's stunningly beautiful. It's gonna be probably the last picture. Ladislav, can you hear? Ladislav?
There we go. Sorry, I can't unmute myself, so okay. I can't answer the questions.
Good.
I wasn't really showing the presentation, so if I could ask Marek to show the last picture from the presentation, maybe.
I think that was the house which.
That was the house in the Redwood City, I guess.
Yeah, yeah.
Which I had the privilege to visit. It's really beautiful, and it was also presented on Jaroslav Polívka's own show, which took place at Stanford Art Gallery. It was a show, I think, in 1955 or 1956. It involved, I think, 6 or 7 Stanford structural engineers and architects, and Jaroslav Polívka was part of this, and he showed this building and the textile blocks that he designed at this exhibition. So that's probably one of the buildings that he built in the San Francisco Bay Area, and that he was really very proud of. But there were many other buildings that he built in the San Francisco Bay Area. I wasn't able to show all of them, but Chinese Methodist Church in Oakland is very interesting, and some other structures are very interesting as well.
Okay, thank you. There is a question about from Christopher Harwood about Egon Hostovský. If Egon Hostovský, who is originally Czech writer who lived later in America and wrote several novels, if he is part of the ticket. Yes, he is. We had one chapter about writers and people who were journalists, and he is part of this sort of chapter. So he is in the book, even though there is not a special chapter just for him. He is like part of this group. Then I have this question. Is there a link for the video we saw at the beginning of the program? Yes, we can post the link on the Czech Center Facebook, I assume, right, Marek? And also it's on, the link is also, I believe, in on the website of Czech Center, of Czech National Trust. I am sorry. Czechoslovak Society of Arts. Have you considered the architect Antonín Reimann for the ticket as well? He also worked with Frank Lloyd Wright. I don't know about him, Ladislav. Do you know about, do you hear me? Do you know about Antonín Reimann?
Yes, Antonín Reimann, but I believe that the concept of the book was to present the stories of people who emigrated right before the Second World War. But Antonín Reimann came to the United States, I think in 1916, during the First World War, and he became part of Frank Lloyd Wright's studio, and then he moved to Japan, and then he was a supervisor for the Tokyo Hotel, but that was not the case for this book. But yeah, we know about, of course I know about his cooperation with Frank Lloyd Wright. Jaroslav Polívka was not the first Czech person who cooperated with Frank Lloyd Wright. Actually, Frank Lloyd Wright wrote in one of his letters, I think to Polívka or about Polívka, that he had a really good experience with Czech architects because they were very well trained in engineering and calculations and the technical part of the job, and they also had great imagination, and they were trained in modern ways how to build. So he was particularly fond of Czech architects. Yeah.
Okay, there is a question to Véronique. When did Véronique grow up in New York City? What years?
New York City was, and still is to this day, really home. I wasn't born here, but it was always home base. And I was born in '66, so late 60s, the 70s, I remember very well. In the 80s, of course, was when I was really moving around the city as a kid.
Thank you. There's another question about, do you have images of 1939 Czech pavilion, Czech World's Fair pavilion? Yes, in the book you can find some pictures of the pavilion, and also one of the pictures which we have shown during the presentation of Ladislav Zikmund Lander. One picture, there was this picture with sort of flag being pulled up. I don't know if you remember that picture. That is basically done when the Czech pavilion at the New York World Fair Center was opened. there is a question, another question about the book. Yes, book is not available now in New York, but it will be available next year during the when the program is running there. We have to bring it there, so it's just take us some transportation work. And Véronique, there's a question about your father. Your father brought the score of Dvořák piano concert with him. What do you know about that?
Well, what I know about it is that he had that score with him in Paris. When he was leaving Paris the night after the phone call that I referenced, he had to just take very, very little with him because they really were running on foot. So he left all his scores behind in Paris. And there was a friend of his who was, can't remember her first name, but she was the daughter from Mulwa's first marriage. And she actually came and found my father in Marseille several weeks after he had left Paris. And I remember he said she brought me a suitcase in which there was butter and that Dvořák score. So that was how it was reunited with him before he left Europe, and then he did bring it with him. He kept it with him and brought it here. That's what I know.
Thank you. There is a message from Susan Halsey to Julia. I loved your father, enormously generous and kind man, young until his death. I believe it's true because I also met him and I have had the same feeling. Yes. There is is the writer Hans Natonek included in book? And I'm sorry, no, I don't know if he really belonged to sort of like, we had to sort of make sort of like a border, who is gonna be in the project, because there are obviously many people were emigrating during the years. So what we really were researching were the people who left in the beginning of World War II, and just this time period, because otherwise, and we had to also, even though we had to choose, so we sort of decided for these people which are in the project, which we consider it like most important and most influencing. So sorry about this. And there was another question which I could see. Oh, it's about Paul Ferlinger. Yes, the question is, Paul Ferlinger was the filmmaker, animated filmmaker who was in the introductory movie. And there is a question if that woman who appears with Paul Ferlinger in the film at one point in his is Helena. Yes, it's Helena Ferlinger, and it's not his second wife, Sandra, who is named in the soundtrack. I'm sorry, it's like that. That's what basically we work with material which Paul sent us, and we didn't have any picture with Sandra. We only had the picture with Helena. So we are sorry about it. And Yeah, I think that's basically all what I could find here in your questions. So hopefully we manage to answer your questions. And at this point, I think that I will give my stand to Marek, who will sort of say goodbye to us, as I understand. Marco?
Thank you very much, Eva, and thank you to all our guests for sharing these very personal and remarkable stories. It was very special, and we enjoyed very much. And thank you all for joining us today. I very much hope we can all meet together next fall in an opening at the Bohemian National Hall. And before we say goodbye, I would like to invite you also to the upcoming events of the Czech Center, because we are fully online. So this is going to be the talk by the US-based Czech curator Milena Kalinovská about the great Czech artists that contributed to the world's art history. For more information, visit our website, czechcenter.com. Also for the details and registration, this is going to be on Zoom again. And also follow us on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. And stay tuned for our upcoming program. I hope to see you all soon again, and thank you and good night.